What if everything you thought you knew about your company was a lie? What if, behind the closed doors of your office, the very people who make your empire possible are struggling just to survive? This is the story of one CEO who, after years of power and success, discovers that the truth about his employees and his own actions was far darker than he ever imagined. David had everything: wealth, status, and the admiration of his peers. But as he sat alone in his office that rainy night, something gnawed at him, a nagging feeling that he wasn't truly connected to the people who work for him. The workers who, despite their loyalty, struggled in silence, fighting battles he couldn't see. The call was short, and the words were chilling. One of your employees is living in their car. They're barely making ends meet, and they're not the only one. His stomach churned as he realized the horrifying truth. How had he missed this? How could he have built an empire and not seen the pain hidden behind the smiles of his employees? For the first time in years, David knew what he had to do. He had to see it with his own eyes. No more meetings in the boardroom, no more numbers on paper. He had to go undercover. But little did he know, the journey he was about to take would change not only the lives of his employees, but his own. This isn't just about fixing a broken system. It's about redemption. And sometimes, the truth isn't what you expect. One man, one undercover mission, a story that will change everything. David Westbrook had always been a man of principle. As CEO of Westbrook Enterprises, his leadership was built on a foundation of hard work, integrity, and loyalty. But as the company had grown over the years, so had the gap between David and the very people who made his success possible. It had been years since he truly connected with his employees, and that realization had begun to weigh heavily on his conscience. One sleepless night, as he looked out over the city from his penthouse office, David came to a decision. He would go undercover. He needed to understand the reality of his company beyond the glossy reports and boardroom meetings. He needed to see firsthand what was happening at the ground level, what his employees truly thought of him, and what their lives were really like. David's plan was simple. He would dress down, take on a fake identity, and work alongside his employees in a low-level position without revealing who he really was. It was a risky move, but he felt it was the only way to uncover the truth. The next morning, David arrived at the Westbrook Enterprises office building dressed in a worn hoodie, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He carried a fake ID under the name, Alex Thomas, and a briefcase filled with documents that looked like they belonged to an everyday worker. He had no intention of going into the upper floors, where the executives roamed. Instead, he headed straight for the customer service department, where the real work happened. When he walked through the doors, the receptionist barely glanced up, but David could see the stress in her eyes. He nodded to her and made his way to the back, where a group of employees were quietly chatting over their coffee break. One of them, a young woman in her late 20s, looked up as David approached. Her name tag read Emily. "Hi there," David said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm new. Is there anything I can do to help?" Emily gave him a polite but distracted smile. "Sure, you can take a seat. We're just getting ready to start another round of calls." David sat down at an empty desk, watching the employees around him. He had expected the usual hustle and bustle of a corporate environment, but what he saw shocked him. People looked exhausted, their faces drawn with fatigue. It wasn't just a 9-to-5 job for them. It was a life-sucking routine that they seemed to be trapped in. The phones rang incessantly, each call adding to the tension that was building in the room. As the day wore on, David learned the names of the workers around him, each one with their own story, their own struggle. There was Jane, a single mother with 2 kids, who barely made ends meet. Greg, an older man who had worked at Westbrook Enterprises for over 20 years, but had been passed over for promotions time and time again. And then there was Emily, who had been with the company for just over a year, but was clearly on the brink of burnout. The more David observed, the more his heart sank. He had built this company on promises of success and opportunity. But what he saw before him was a system that was chewing people up and spitting them out. They weren't just employees. They were people with hopes, dreams, and families, and his company had failed to support them. But it was one moment, late in the afternoon, that would change everything for David. It was nearing the end of the shift when Emily, looking more tired than usual, stood up and began to gather her things. David could see the strain in her movements, her shoulders hunched, her steps slow and deliberate. Without thinking, he followed her out of the office, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Something didn't feel right. He caught up to her in the hallway, just as she was about to exit the building. "Emily, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She stopped, her eyes flicking to him in surprise. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need to get home. I'm just so tired." David couldn't help but notice how her voice cracked. It was clear she was holding something back. "You don't look fine," he said gently. "What's really going on?" Emily's face crumpled, and she looked down at the floor. It's my living situation," she whispered. "I've been staying in a friend's apartment, but she's moving out, and I don't have anywhere to go. I've been looking for a place for months, but I just can't afford it. The rent is too high, and I can't let my family know how bad it is." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm just one paycheck away from losing everything." David's mind spun. He had known things were tough for some of his employees, but this was different. Emily, a hard-working and loyal employee, was living on the edge of homelessness, struggling just to survive. His heart ached for her, and in that moment, he realized how deeply he had failed. "I can help," David said before he could stop himself. "I know you don't want charity, but please, let me help you find a place." Emily shook her head. "I can't take that from you. I'll figure something out." But David was already thinking ahead. He couldn't let her, or anyone else, continue to suffer in silence. The next day, he went to a real estate agent and found the perfect home for Emily. A cozy, 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, not too far from the office. He made the arrangements, taking care of the deposit and rent, ensuring Emily would never have to worry about her living situation again. But the real shock came when Emily received a letter from the company's HR department, addressed to her personally. It was a formal notification informing her that her living situation had been reviewed, and the company had decided to take care of her housing situation as part of their employee welfare initiative. Emily was speechless. David had used his undercover guys to gain more than just a glimpse into the struggles of his employees. He had uncovered the deep, systemic issues that needed to be addressed. He had seen firsthand how his company had let people like Emily down, and he knew he couldn't let this continue. But as the days passed, David realized that this was just the beginning. There were more employees like Emily, more stories of silent suffering. The truth about his company was far worse than he had ever imagined. And now, David was faced with a choice. Continue to hide in the shadows of corporate power, or rise to the challenge and fight to change the system he had built. But before he could act on his newfound knowledge, a call came in late one evening that would shake him to his core. A call from Emily, who had learned the true identity of Alex Thomas. David had barely processed the weight of the message when the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. He stepped out, trying to steady his breath. His mind raced, running through every possible scenario. Emily knew his secret, and somehow, she knew he was more than just a random employee. But what did she plan to do with that knowledge? Would she expose him? Or could she be the ally he desperately needed? He pulled out his phone again, his fingers trembling as he typed a quick response. "How do you know who I am?" The message felt like a weight in his hand. He stared at the screen, waiting, praying for a simple answer, but none came. Minutes passed. He paced the floor of the office lobby, staring at his phone, unable to sit still. Every second felt like an eternity. Just as he was about to give up, the phone buzzed. "I've known for a while. I saw you the first day you showed up, asking questions. You've been looking at things from the outside, but you're too late. The system is broken, but you can fix it. It's up to you." David stared at the words, trying to process them. She wasn't angry. She wasn't demanding anything. It was as if she was giving him a choice. He could still fix it. But how? He glanced around the office, his eyes falling on the managers who had been in the meeting earlier. He felt their eyes on him. He couldn't trust them anymore. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had to act fast before the entire company was consumed by greed and deceit. But he didn't have all the answers. He needed help. Help from someone who knew the truth. Someone who wasn't afraid to stand up. David quickly typed back, "Meet me tonight. I'll be in the parking lot after hours. We need to talk." He hit send and felt a small sense of relief. For the first time in days, he had a plan. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt crept in. Was this a mistake? Could he trust Emily? And what if the others were already onto him? Later that evening, after the office had cleared out and the lights dimmed, David made his way to the parking lot. He walked with purpose, trying to quell the anxiety bubbling in his chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty space, a stark reminder of how much he had to lose. He reached his car and waited. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. He checked his phone again. No messages. His pulse quickened. What if she didn't show? What if she was just leading him into a trap? Then, as if on cue, he saw a shadow moving toward him. He turned, his heart leaping in his chest. Emily stepped into the dim light, her figure familiar yet different. She had always been a quiet presence in the office, sharp, observant, but always hiding something behind those eyes. Now she looked different. The weight of the day's revelations seemed to have aged her beyond her years. She was still young, but the lines of stress and hardship were visible in the way she held herself. "I didn't think you'd come," David said, his voice a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I didn't think you'd ask," Emily replied, her tone steady. She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed as if guarding herself from whatever was to come next. David gestured for her to sit, and she hesitated for a moment before nodding. She slid into the passenger seat of his car, and the door clicked shut behind her. He turned to face her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. "I don't know how to fix this. I can't just change everything overnight. There's so much at stake. So much that I missed." "You missed everything, David," Emily said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been watching the system unravel for far too long. The hours, the late nights, the families who barely scraped by because you didn't see them. All the while, you were sitting in your office, blind to the truth. David winced, the guilt washing over him like a tide. "I never meant for it to happen this way." "I know you didn't," she said, her voice softening. "But now you have a choice. You can either keep pretending everything's fine, or you can face the reality and change it. You're not just the CEO. You're the reason these people are still fighting. You have the power to fix this, but you have to be ready to give up everything." He looked out at the dark parking lot, his mind racing. He had worked his whole life for this, his company, his empire. But what was it all worth if the very people who made it successful were living in misery? "Tell me what you need me to do," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Emily hesitated, her eyes locking onto his. "There's a meeting tomorrow. The employees, those who are still with us, they want to speak out. They're ready to stand up to the managers. They're ready to fight for their rights. But they need your backing. Without it, we don't stand a chance." David nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. "I'll stand with them. I'll back them up. But I need to know something first, Emily. Why haven't you exposed me already? You could have done that." She met his gaze, her eyes unreadable. "Because I believed you could change. I believed that you could do the right thing." David swallowed hard. "I don't deserve your trust." "You deserve a chance to prove it," she said, her voice steady. Just then, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Derek. The screen flashed. "David, we've got a major problem. The class action lawsuit is escalating faster than we thought. We've been served papers. They're going public tomorrow." David's heart dropped into his stomach. The walls were closing in, and time was running out. The lawsuit was going to be a disaster. And now, with Emily's help, he had a chance to make it right. But what would happen when the company found out what he was planning? He looked at Emily, determination setting into his features. "Tomorrow, I'm going to change everything. I'll be there with the employees. We'll face the managers, together. No more hiding." She nodded, her eyes softening. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." The clock was ticking, and David could feel the pressure mounting. The meeting was set for 9 a.m. the next morning, an all-hands meeting with the employees. The air was thick with tension as he walked through the office corridors, his eyes scanning the familiar faces that had no idea what was about to happen. Today would change everything. David could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one behind the curtains, pulling the strings. But now, for the first time, he was going to have to face the consequences of his blind ambition. He had ignored the very people who had helped him build Westbrook Enterprises. The employees, the heart and soul of his business. He stopped in front of the conference room door and took a deep breath, steeling himself. He was about to expose everything, the lies, the manipulation, the broken promises. But he wasn't doing it alone. Emily had gathered the employees who were ready to stand by him, to expose the truth. As David entered the conference room, the room fell silent. He glanced around, taking in the faces of his employees, some wary, some hopeful, others still unsure of what was about to unfold. In the far corner of the room, Emily stood, her arms crossed, watching him closely. She was the only one who truly understood the magnitude of this moment. David took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the room. This company, it was built on the hard work of each and every one of you. But I failed you. I failed to see the reality of your lives, the sacrifices you've made, and the toll it's taken on you. The employees exchanged glances, confusion, and curiosity in their eyes. He could feel their skepticism. They had been let down by their leaders too many times before. But this time, it was different. This time, David was telling the truth. I've been blind, he continued. And for that, I am truly sorry. I've watched many of you struggle while I sat in my office, oblivious to the pain and hardship that you faced. That ends today. We're going to make things right. Not just for some of you, but for all of you. Emily stepped forward, her eyes never leaving David's. She nodded, and with a subtle gesture, she signaled for the employees to sit. The time had come. David motioned to the screen behind him, where the presentation he had prepared was projected. This is the real cost of our company. The hours worked, the lives sacrificed. But it's also the chance for us to change, to fix the mistakes we've made, to create a future where no one is left behind. The room was still. Every employee in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the next step. They weren't sure if they should believe him or if this was just another corporate promise, another empty gesture. Then, David did something unexpected. He looked directly at the managers seated at the front of the room, the same managers who had been planning to cover everything up, to silence the whistleblower. They looked back at him, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. You all knew this was happening, David said, his voice firm. You knew the truth, and you chose to ignore it. You allowed this company to thrive on the backs of the employees, who were barely making ends meet. That stops now. I've made my decision. I'm taking the company in a new direction, and it starts with you. David turned to the HR manager, then the head of operations. One by one, he addressed them all, his eyes unwavering. I'm giving you a choice. You can either step down and take responsibility for your actions, or you can leave. Your call. The room was thick with tension. Some of the managers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. David could see the fear in their eyes. This wasn't the same CEO they were used to. This was a man who was willing to face the consequences of his actions. But David wasn't done yet. He turned to Emily, who was still standing at the back of the room, her eyes locked onto his. And then there's you, Emily, he said, his voice softening. You've been the one to show me what matters. You've been the one to make sure that I didn't forget what this company is really about. I've seen what you've done for everyone here, and I'm giving you a position you've more than earned. You're going to be the one to help lead the change. You've been my eyes and ears. Now, I want you to be my partner in making this right. Emily's eyes widened, a mix of shock and disbelief on her face. For a moment, she couldn't speak. But then, slowly, she nodded. David's heart swelled with a sense of relief. He had made the right decision. But there was still more to be done. There was still one more thing he had to do. He pulled out his phone, sending a quick message to his assistant, Derek. It was time. The next morning, The first thing David did was take Emily and the other employees who had stood by him to the property he had purchased for them. It wasn't just any property. It was a safe, beautiful neighborhood with homes large enough to house their families comfortably. It was a new beginning, a symbol of what was possible when people worked together and supported one another. David drove up to the property, his heart racing with excitement. The employees who had joined him stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. They couldn't believe this was happening. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The story of David and his employees is a reminder that the true strength of a company lies in its people, not its profits. No matter how far you've come or how much you've achieved, there's always room for growth, humility, and redemption. If you believe that change is possible and that we can all make a difference in the lives of others, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. How would you handle a situation like David's? What lessons have you learned from this story?